If you still do need a church Bible, do feel free to put your hand up and one can be brought to you. When you have one, please turn back to page 878, and that will take you back to the passage in Luke that we're looking at this morning. There were Sermon Search prizes today. Both of them were given out in the first service. And we're looking at the passage, chapter 18, verse 31 through 43. And the title of our sermon this morning is "To See Jesus for Who He is a Work of God." To see Jesus for who He is a work of God. That was true for the beggar that met Jesus. Physically, he needed Jesus to be able to see. And it was true for Jesus' disciples spiritually as well. For them to see spiritually, they needed a work of God. And Luke, in this passage that we're looking at, is purposely contrasting the blindness of his disciples with the blind beggar's ability to see, even though he's blind. That's the purposeful contrast. Later on, you'll see that Luke is also contrasting the fact that here at Jericho, in front of the gates, the blind man kind of sees and welcomes Jesus and names him as the Son of David. But when he gets to Jerusalem, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem in chapter 19, verse 41, 42. He weeps over them and he says, "These things are hidden from you now, just like things are hidden from the disciples." So you can see the contrast that Luke is trying to make between this man and how he sees though he is blind, and how the disciples don't see even though they are hearing. So in verse 44, we're told that the things were hidden from them. But as we say, when the blind man in verse 38 is told that Jesus of Nazareth is passing by, he immediately knows that he is Jesus, the Son of David. He sees even though he is blind. And so let's take us a walk through this passage a little bit. And the first of our headings is going to be the final stretch. The final stretch. Jesus is in the final stretch up to Jerusalem. That's what we see in verse 31. He talks to his disciples off to the side, and the reason he does it, he says, is because Jerusalem is very near. And of course, Jericho, the city that they're just about to come to, is very close to Jerusalem. Just 30 kilometers further on, they get to Jerusalem. So one good day's walk and they're at Jerusalem. Even though it might be a steep walk, they have to go up, ascend a kilometer, but needless to say, it's just 30 kilometers away. And in Jericho, while Jesus is in Jericho, he is going to tell a parable. And in that parable, he tells it because he is close to Jerusalem. Look at chapter 19, verse 11. As they heard these things, Jesus proceeded to tell a parable because he was near Jerusalem. So do you see and do you sense that Jesus senses and knows that it's important, that it's significant that he's getting near Jerusalem? They've been journeying, he and his disciples and the crowd, they've been journeying to Jerusalem since chapter 9 of this book. And along the way, Jesus has taken opportunities to tell them that he will suffer and he will die and be put to death in Jerusalem. But what felt like a distant reality at the beginning of the journey now feels like a very close reality now that they come near Jericho. So if you imagine a family pulling into the hospital car park, and all the family get out of the car and they're all going to go into the building, but it's only the mother who is going to have open heart surgery. She's going to feel that a little bit more than the rest of the family, I think. It's going to weigh on her a bit more. And that's Jesus as he gets closer to Jerusalem. So this crowd approaching Jericho with Jesus is an unusual crowd. There is happiness. There is optimism. There is conversation. There is laughter. But also there are times where there is a sense of fear that grips those who follow Jesus. Mark, in his account, he puts it like this. he says, they were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished. That carries a kind of nervous astonishment. They were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. You see, they knew they were heading to something serious, even though they couldn't quite put their finger on it. And so before actually arriving at Jericho, Jesus stops the traveling group and he calls his disciples away on their own and reminds them of what awaits him at Jerusalem. And this is the 7th time that Jesus, in some way or other, has spoken about what is going to happen to him in Jerusalem. But this is the most detailed time and the most detailed information. And in this encounter, we see that the disciples are blind. They have a spiritual blindness. They know Jesus, but they don't know who he really is. And so that's our second heading this morning, the blind disciples. Jesus says to them there in verse 31, at Jerusalem, everything written about me by the prophets will be accomplished. And he goes on to list a number of things. In that word accomplished, he is recognizing his Father's sovereign control over all that is happening. Jesus is saying, my death is not an accident. I and the Father planned it in eternity past. The prophets promised it as God revealed it to them. So he is saying, listen, I am the Passover lamb that the Old Testament spoke about. I am the atoning sacrifice that was played out in the Old Testament. I am the promised son of Eve and of Abraham and of David. I am the servant that Isaiah spoke about, who would be spat upon, who would have his beard pulled out, who would be whipped, who would be beaten and killed. And he says, I am the one who will pay for the sins of my people. I'm the one spoken about, and I'm even the one who will rise again to life. Jesus is saying, all of this has been decided in the counsel of God, and I have been fulfilling it every day of my life. And now, everything is about to reach fulfillment. It's about to reach its climax in Jerusalem. The Messiah will die for his people and then rise again. How much clearer does Jesus need to be? But his disciples are blind. We're told in verse 34, they don't understand. They don't grasp it. And why don't they grasp it? Well, we'll give him one explicit answer. Because it was hidden from them. And that means that it was God's sovereign will. That's what that phrase means. It's hidden by whom? By God. God hides it from them. He doesn't give them full understanding. It's an act of God. That's a very serious thing that we should take in this morning. Everyone here, you can't see Jesus for who he is unless God opens your eyes. That is true for those lost in darkness right now. And it is true for those who are in the light of his light. If you're going to see more of him, you still need him. We can't make ourselves see. That's why the attitude of the blind beggar is such a wonderful example and help to us. He cries out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. If you don't know Jesus this morning, your intellect won't reveal him. And if you don't know Jesus this morning, your effort won't find him. Yet don't throw away your effort and intellect. Use them in seeking Jesus, but they won't open your eyes. Only Jesus can do that. But listen, Jesus says to you this morning, just as he did to the blind beggar, what do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? What a loving, gracious question. I wonder how will you answer that this morning? How will you answer it? I can do it myself. I'll do it. Or will you say, Jesus, yes, I'm a mess inside. There are things, there are issues. Have mercy on me. Please open my eyes. But did you know, even though God must open our eyes, and even though he is sovereign over our blindness, the reasons for our blindness will be found in our own hearts and behavior. So we can ask, why else were these disciples blind when Jesus spoke so clearly? And there are a number of answers, but we are just going to consider one reason for their blindness. And that is their fixed convictions. Their fixed convictions, their fixed ideas. And you see the fixed ideas that we've seen coming through in the gospel that the disciples had is that they still, even though they knew Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of David, they still thought he was going to be a military deliverer in a way. They still thought he was going to go up to Jerusalem and he was going to put down the Romans. He was going to establish the kingdom there and then. So instead of going in on a donkey, they thought he would go in on a war horse. And that's why Jesus told the parable in part. Look again at chapter 19, verse 11. And as they heard these things, Jesus proceeded to tell them a parable because he was near to Jerusalem and because they supposed that the kingdom of God was to appear immediately. He was going to make it happen now in a political and militarily kind of way. So for the disciples, this fixed idea prevented them from hearing Jesus' words and seeing who he was. Did you realize that fixed ideas can really do that? They can block up your ears. Even though you hear things so clearly, you don't hear them. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he was a Russian prisoner. He was a Russian and he was a prisoner of Joseph Stalin. And he was put in prison in 1945 and he was there in different forms for 8 years. When he first became a prisoner in one of Stalin's prison camps, he shared a prison cell with Anatoly Ilyich Fastenko. Now Fastenko, he was a wise man. He might have even been a godly man. And Solzhenitsyn and Fastenko, they talked for hours over political matters. But at this time, Solzhenitsyn fundamentally disagreed with Fastenko. Later, this is what Solzhenitsyn wrote about those conversations in his famous book, The Gulag Archipelago. Listen to what he said. One thing is absolutely definite. Not everything that enters our ears penetrates our consciousness. Anything too far out of tune with our attitude is lost, either in the ears themselves or somewhere beyond, but it is lost. And even though I remember Fastenko's many stories, I recall his opinions, but vaguely. Well, that's what's happening to the disciples. Their fixed ideas about the Messiah mean they don't hear the truth about Jesus. They can't see who he is, even though he explains it clearly. Now, what about you this morning? What fixed convictions are making you blind to the truth of Jesus? What ideologies of society are you convinced of that are making you blind to truth in Jesus? These are questions for everyone here. Christian, you who say, Jesus has opened my eyes, what ideologies are making you blind to Jesus? Where do you find yourself disagreeing with him in his words because you are accepting other fixed ideas and holding them tightly? And there's a lot of pressure to hold fixed ideas. Whether you're a believer or an unbeliever this morning, what should you do? What should you do this morning? Well, you should cry out. The blind man's your example. Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. I realize I can't see unless you help me. I want to see. I want to see. Well, after Jesus has spoken to his disciples, they rejoin the crowd and they journey on and they arrive at the gates of Jericho. And this is where we meet the blind beggar. And that's our third point, the seeing blind man. Let's take in a few details. As we said, he's begging by the side of the road. Verse 35. And it must be very, very near to the entrance into the city, because we're told in verse 35 they drew near to the city, and that's not kind of miles off, that is close. Now Jericho was an upmarket city. It had very fertile lands around about it, so there was good amount of wealth going on, and it had a lovely climate. It had a warm winter climate, so some of the rich people up in Jerusalem, they had summer homes down in Jericho. And that might be why we find the beggar outside the city walls, because there might well have been a kind of regulation from the rich people that said, no beggars in the city. And that's certainly where we find him. And this beggar was very unclean to look at. Mark's gospel gives him the name Bartimaeus, which means son of filth, son of uncleanness. I don't think that's the name his mother gave him. Surely such a man would have known his place in society. He would have known that he was inferior to others. He would have been afraid and intimidated of large crowds. He would have known when to be silent and to bow his head in other people's company. But that's not what we find. That's not what he does. The noise of Jesus and his followers passing by gets his interest and attention. Verse 36. And he asks the crowd, why all this noise? What's going on? And they reply, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. And immediately, I love it, he doesn't, he rejects that description immediately. He says, no, Jesus, Son of David. He immediately knows who is passing by. How and why, we don't know, but he knows. He gives him such an exalted title. Son of David, you're the Messiah, you're the promised king. I know who you are. This man knows something. He sees who Jesus is. The crowd doesn't. Not like he does. So there's a warning. There's a warning for every gathered Christian here this morning. We can be a blind following crowd of Jesus if we're not careful. We believe in Jesus, but we don't really know him. That is not what we want to have happen. We want to know him. Know him. We don't just want to be going along in the crowd with Jesus of Nazareth. Well, the crowd tell the man to shut up, but he shouts out all the more, verse 39. Don't you like that? Don't you like his persistence? It's a wonderful response. He isn't put off. He knows this is his opportunity for healing. And he's urgent with his crying out. Now, you might remember at the start of this chapter in 18, Jesus told the parable of the widow. And it was an example of persistence in prayer. We are to persist in prayer over a long period of time. But here with the blind beggar, we're getting another example of persistence in prayer. But this time, it's a persistence of urgency. Pushing through. In the short term. Crying out. And not being dissuaded or pushed back. Do we pray with urgency? Do we pray with urgency over the right issues? I've just finished an autobiography of a man called Paul Hattaway. He is a missionary to China, even today, and to Southeast Asia. And he's been a missionary for a long time. And he comes from New Zealand, so he spent many years away from his family in New Zealand. And he came to learn when he was in China one time that his father, who did not believe in Jesus, was very, very close to death, within hours of death, on his deathbed. And he is in China. And he shares his burden with a group of Chinese house leaders, church house leaders, about his father and how he hasn't been able to see him for so long. And the group of Chinese house church leaders, they get down on their knees and they begin to pray urgently. And they pray urgently for 40 minutes. And the time isn't important. That's just what it was in this case. They prayed for 40 minutes. And after 40 minutes, they all fell silent together. And there was a sense that they had been heard by God. And when Paul Hattaway did get back to New Zealand, he heard the wonderful news that a pastor had visited his father in the last hours of his life. And this hard man who had rejected Jesus all his life, had trusted in him. This is not an isolated example of urgent prayer, of urgent answered prayer from those in the church who give themselves to prayer. I long to know this more. What about you? There is a place for urgent prayer as well as long-term persevering prayer. Now at this point, we'll carry on the story with a couple of questions. And the question that we're going to ask first is, are you a husher or an usher? Now that might not make sense, but I hope it will shortly. Are you a husher or an usher? You see, wonderfully in verse 40, Jesus stops. He hears the blind man and he stops. He's going to give him time. But did you notice, Jesus made the ones who had said to him, shut up, shh, hush. He makes them bring the beggar to him. Jesus was teaching them a lesson. He was gently saying, you are out of step with me. I have time for the poor and rejected. If you're going to follow me, you need to have time for them too. So he turns the hushers, the shh people, he turns them into ushers, people that bring others to Jesus. You know, I can be a husher. In my heart, I can say, shh, be quiet to a brother or sister who might be needy. I can resent their neediness. I can want to pass by them while I'm following Jesus. Of course, the irony is, I'm as needy as they are. That's the irony. We all have our deep needs. But Jesus doesn't want hushers in his family. He wants ushers. Ones who seek to bring others to him. What a family HCC would be if we were ushers to one another. Well, there's a second question. And the second question is, do you prefer the security of your blindness? Do you prefer the security of your blindness? Would you rather stay in the place that you are, in the dark, rather than stepping into the light of Jesus Christ? You know, when the blind man is brought to Jesus, Jesus asks him a huge question in verse 41. And Jesus said to him, verse 41, he said, Lord, verse 41, what do you want me to do for you? That's a wonderful question. What do you want me to do for you? Maybe you think that's a silly question. Maybe you think the answer is obvious. The man is blind. Of course he wants to see. And of course that's what he goes on and asks for in verse 41. But it isn't a silly question. And the answer isn't a foregone conclusion. You see, for this blind man to say, I want to see, takes faith. He must be willing to step into a new reality, a wonderful reality, but a new and different reality. He has to be willing to step out into uncertainty. He has to be willing to leave security behind. There was a certain security and stability in his life. He may be blind, but he had a routine. He knew where to beg. He knew those people that would give to him on a regular basis. He may be blind, but he knew what to do with this life. His life might be in darkness, but it was a life he knew. It's not easy to step out of those kind of lives sometimes. So to say to Jesus, yes, I want to recover my sight, was to invite huge change. Wonderful change, but frightening change. He can't beg anymore. He will have to work to live. He doesn't even know what he will be able to do or where he will go. A frightening, wonderful new life stands before him. Does someone here this morning want to say what this man said to Jesus? Jesus, I want to see. I want to see. I'm frightened about the radical change it will bring. I don't know all that it will mean for tomorrow, but I don't want to stay living in the dark any longer. I want to see. I want to know you. I want to be known by you. I want the life you have. Please save me. And the assurance you get from this encounter with Jesus is that if you cry out to Jesus, he will save you. He will save you. And so our final heading is the saved man. Because that's what we see. Jesus says to him in verse 42, your faith has made you well. That phrase, made well, is the same word in Greek as saved. Your faith has saved you. So Jesus isn't only confirming his physical healing, but he's affirming his spiritual sight. Yes, son of uncleanness, I know you, and you know me. You know who I am. I wonder when Bartimaeus first got his sight back and he looked at Jesus, the one he had called the Son of David, was Jesus what he expected to see? We know Jesus was just an ordinary man. And yet we see he followed him because he had sight. He knew who Jesus was. Bartimaeus had faith in him. As we said in verse 42, Jesus has said to Bartimaeus, your faith has made you well. Now, it's important that we understand what Jesus is and isn't saying there. Jesus isn't saying your faith, it's your faith that has healed you. He's not saying that. Of course not. Jesus is the one who has just healed him. If Jesus doesn't speak and command, he does not get healed. End of story. Jesus heals this man. Don't believe the lie in many churches today that your faith can bring you wealth or bring you health or bring you salvation as long as you have enough strong faith. That's a lie of the devil. No, Jesus heals this man and Jesus alone. But the channel, the means by which it comes to the man is by his faith. And that faith is a gift from God. He doesn't produce it. And yet here in the story, we hear the voice of faith as it shouts out from the man, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. There's faith. And whoever will call out to Jesus Christ and put their trust in him and say, I need you, that is faith. And Jesus will respond. And so this man is saved. He is healed. He can see. And what does he do with his new sight? Well, he does the one thing we all should do. He follows Jesus. He follows Jesus. The seeing man follows Jesus. The seeing woman follows Jesus. In Mark's account of this passage, when Jesus has healed him and given him his sight, Jesus, in a way, tests him slightly. He says, go your way. Go your way. And which way does the man go? He follows Jesus. Verse 43. And immediately recovered his sight and followed him, glorifying God. Is that you this morning? Are you following Jesus? Has Jesus opened your eyes? Let me ask you that question. Has Jesus opened your eyes? Then are you following him? Or are you following the world? Are you loving him? Or are you loving the world? You can't do both. You can't do both. Paul, when he writes to the Corinthians, he says, you need to test yourself. You need to examine yourself. This is what he says. Examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Christ is in you? Unless, of course, you fail the test. We don't examine ourselves by looking back at some past commitment of faith. That's not how we examine ourselves. We examine ourselves by looking in our heart now, today, and asking, am I loving Jesus today? Am I choosing his way today? Is my faith a persevering faith today? Or has my initial enthusiasm died, just like the seed in the stony soil that shot up with life, but withered away, leaving empty ground? These are serious things, my dear brothers and sisters. We don't breeze through life following Jesus. Yes, he holds us. Yes, he has a great, secure, eternal grip. But today, when you look in your heart, do you love him? Is your heart soft? Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Like they did in the wilderness and fell. So if there's a challenge to you this morning, if God is speaking to you and challenging you this morning, then listen, Jesus says, what do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? Do you want me to give you sight? Do you want me to open up your eyes more to see my glory? Then ask me. If you've never seen me before, then ask me. I am standing by. I have given my life. I have come to this earth. I have lived a perfect life. I have died as a substitute on a cross. I have risen again with the power of God so that all who believe in me can know forgiveness forever, washed in the blood of the Lamb. And that is on offer to you right now, to either grow in that or to step into it for the first time. Amen.